I'd like to welcome those of you who are students to an evening that I think is going to be exceptionally interesting and relevant for those of us who care about America's voice and what we say and how we say it and what we report to the rest of the world. I welcome those of you who are in the world of international broadcasting and public diplomacy, because this is one of the most important arms and components of those very important efforts. Yet nothing can be taken for granted, right? And nothing is not under siege at a time of information overload when everybody joins the party. So what we'll do tonight is I'm going to introduce our speaker. I'm going to speak with him for a few minutes here, and then I want to open it up to the room for your comments and questions mostly, because this is actually a very important and unusual opportunity to engage the director of the Voice of America in a conversation. Who are we? Who is the Voice? What is David and this incredible organization, which is so steeped in history, up to and doing now? It's a great pleasure to introduce David to you. He is a friend, he is and has been a colleague, and he is a true leader now. And to have shared part of this trajectory with him when we shared our times together at CNN, and to see the contribution that he is making now is simply, well, a privilege and quite fascinating. He is the 28th director of the Voice of America, and he was sworn into that position in June of 2011. So will be coming up on 4 years in the job. And in that time, he's made a great number of changes organizationally and administratively and technologically, because that's what the world demands. As director of the VOA, he oversees a remarkable worldwide, diverse isn't the word for it, organization, reaching more than 170 million people a week around the globe, and each week engaging these platforms we call radio and television and internet. And what's so delicious and challenging about his job is what he is running really is an incredibly complex organization. Hello, Alan. That is part journalism, part media, part technology, part diplomacy, part United Nations, because of all the nationalities and interests that he must deal with. 3 decades in journalism. As I mentioned, we were at CNN together some years ago. David also worked at ABC and NPR. He has covered any number of things. At CNN, he was CNN's very, very able national security correspondent. And David has also been in the private sector. So he brings a number of perspectives to this job and to this talk this evening. Now, the other thing that David is a remarkably great thinker and fantastic dresser. So I want to compliment him on his tie this evening and welcome David up to the front of the room. David. We really did not plan this, but
it's a little bit of a surprise. Well, Frank, thank you very much for that kind introduction. It's such a pleasure to be here at George Washington University, an honor to be here in a place that is such an important part of the intellectual life of our nation's capital. To discuss something I've spent my life working on and thinking about, and that's America's relationship with the rest of the world, and specifically America's voice as we communicate to others. Of course, that voice is much more than the U.S. government. Our cultures, our culture, our values and ideas are transmitted powerfully from everything from Hollywood to Hollywood movies to iconic American brands, from pop culture to CNN. Such soft power is perhaps best described by Harvard professor Joseph Nye, who I suspect some of you are reading in classes, who says a nation may obtain the global outcomes it wants, quote, because other countries, admiring its values, emulating its example, aspiring to its level of prosperity and openness, want to follow it. One of the tools in our soft power arsenal is the First Amendment of the Constitution. And freedom of speech is a powerful American export. It is the business that I am in now. As mentioned, after 30 years as a network correspondent at NPR, ABC News, and CNN for the last almost 4 years now, I've been the director of the Voice of America. And I can't help asking this question, ever heard of it before? Before you signed up to come here this evening, because I find as I go around and introduce myself around the country that a fair number of older people often say something like this. Oh, yes, VOA, you helped win the Cold War, right? What is it? Shortwave radio broadcasted to the Soviet Union. What, you still exist? What for? Or younger people who I meet and sometimes say, VOA? No, never heard of it. In a way, that's not surprising because we don't broadcast in the United States. And unlike most countries around the world, our country does not have a state broadcaster. We don't have a national state broadcasting organization on the air here at home. We have no BBC. So as a nation, we tend sometimes to underrate the prestige and the influence that can come with that role if properly executed. We Americans also tend to assume that the private sector may be able to do most things better, and you can count me in as making that assumption in many areas, but this may be one area where that is not true. In fact, the Voice of America is probably one of the most influential news organizations on earth. It is partly because we are the international state broadcaster of the United States. Overseas, we are the BBC, the Deutsche Welle, the Radio France Internationale for the United States. And we reach, as Frank mentioned, 172 million people a week on television, radio, internet, mobile devices, social media, in nearly 50 languages. Take that, CNN. We do it on a budget that is lower than the cost of 2 jet fighters, 2 warplanes. Here in Washington alone, I have almost 1,200 employees, including some terrific journalists, but we tend to be hiding in plain sight here in the nation's capital and poorly understood of it all in official Washington and not well enough supported. Let me take just a few minutes now to tell you, and because I'm a TV guy, I can't resist, to show you what we are, what we do, and why it matters.
Muslims and Christians had lived in peace together.
Watertown, Massachusetts.
VOA is more of a programming production house than a single network. Over 1,600 hours a week of TV and radio broadcasting, about 50 websites, Facebook, Weibo, Twitter, you name it. Within VOA, there are 2 networks aimed at what I call denied areas. One is Weishe, reporting daily on satellite TV in Mandarin to China, plus some Tibetan and Cantonese. Satellite dishes of the kind needed to see us are illegal in China, but widely available. More than 10% of the population have access to them, particularly outside urban areas. Weishe reports the news straight up, with features like History's Mysteries.
Yithang Monastery was bombarded and reduced to rubble in 1956.
Chinese history the Communist Party doesn't want you to know. When the recent Hong Kong protests were in high gear, reporting on them from the BBC and CNN was blacked out in China. But our viewers could see a live feed from the streets of Hong Kong on VOA Weishe.
After a breakthrough year for America,
we also tell Chinese about America, its ideals and debates, and not just the positive stuff. We reported on Ferguson, Missouri, and the NSA surveillance story, and many more like them. And we teach English, including American slang.
Pinky swear is this. Pinky swear， 你不是跟自己 Pinky swear， 你要跟你对方 Pinky swear，Pinky swear，Pinky swear。Don't tell anybody. Okay, I swear. Pinky swear，Pinky swear。高小指。
I'd add that additional sanctions on Iran at this time.
در نشست خبری مشترک در کاخ سفید.
The other network we have is VOA Persian, 6 hours a day of news about Iran and the region, about U.S. policy and culture, music, comedy, and the latest American technology. Every week, almost a quarter of the nation of Iran watches at least one VOA TV show, even though the government there uses jamming techniques to try to block out the signal in some parts of Tehran. Now, look at this. It may be a big part of our future. This is what our mobile device stream in Hausa looks like. Along with audio and written news and photos from our terrific network of stringers in Nigeria and our news team in the U.S., there's also music, sports, and much more. It's aimed at northern Nigeria, where Boko Haram is on the rampage, and it's taking off with young people. In West Africa, we've also upped our game, helping in the fight against the scourge of Ebola, with town meetings on TV and radio, public service announcements, and sharing material with our colleagues at the BBC, including our eyewitness reporting from the center of the epidemic.
After disinfecting the body, the undertakers are preparing themselves to put the body into the body bag.
At this point is the risky part, so it's only advisable to touch the body one time.
The husband can only watch how the undertakers are carrying his dead wife away.
This is a voice speaking from America. Daily at this time, we shall speak to you about America and the war.
Back in 1942, when VOA started, it was all shortwave radio newscasts beamed straight to audiences around the world, and we still do some of that. It's still one of the best ways to reach North Korea or Zimbabwe or Afghanistan, for that matter. But we now reach the majority of our global audience through affiliated radio, TV, and internet partners. And this is where the largest growth potential is.
Selamat malam untuk Anda. Baik. Helmi, sebelum saya berbincang dengan Anda, saya...
For example, we're on 8 out of 11 major TV stations in Indonesia,
Laporan tim VOA.
the world's largest Muslim country.
Este año, más de 140 países se dan cita en la versión número 45.
And in the 3+ years I've been director, VOA's Spanish service has gone from reaching about 4 million people to close to 30 million a week.
Practican un catolicismo ferviente.
We do it with what we call the U.S. Bureau model. We say, hey, TV Azteca Mexico, you do a popular news program for 6 million viewers, but we notice you don't cover the U.S. much. How would you like us to help cover it for you? Latin American broadcasters are competing to sign up and work with us.
Para nuestro canal, las informaciones que ofrece La Voz de América desde el Congreso o desde la Casa Blanca son importantes porque nos permite explicar sobre lo que realmente está sucediendo en materia migratoria en Estados Unidos.
We also have new broadcasting affiliates in Turkey and Kurdish Iraq. We are, in fact, the only international broadcaster in Kurdish. Our news reports shine light into a dark region currently under the thumb of the ISIS terrorist group. But the most challenging place for us right now may be Russia and the former Soviet space. In the weeks after the Russian invasion of Crimea, we doubled our audience in Ukraine on radio, TV, and internet, adding major new affiliates.
Здравствуйте, в эфире «Настоящее время». С вами Наташа Мозговая.
We're also doing a new daily TV news show in Russian with our sister company Radio Free Europe called Current Time, Nastoyaщее время, a straight-shooting TV newscast on the air in Ukraine, Moldova, Latvia, Lithuania, and others. Russia itself is harder. Regular affiliates are out of the question. Putin threw us off Russian TV and radio stations years ago, and Russia jams radio signals from outside the country. In Russia, we do two things: a focused internet strategy, including interactions on live streams with young Russians, and when we can, appearances on Russian cable TV stations. For example, almost every day, our man Misha Gutkin in New York reports on the Russian Business Channel about the stock market and issues like Western sanctions, pocketbook issues for Russians. All this journalism on radio, television, and internet is built on a pretty solid foundation, because what VOA does is honest reporting. And we do that because it is the law of the land. The VOA Charter, which was signed into law back in 1976 by then President Ford, tells us to be, quote, a consistently reliable and authoritative source of news, and to explain American values, culture, and policies. Like most media, VOA is in the credibility business. So it covered civil rights protests, Watergate, and Abu Ghraib just as completely as it covered moon landings and the election of the first Black American president. That's what gives us credibility with our audiences, that we tell the truth about ourselves, that we're honest about the debates that we have inside of our own country. Periodically, some politicians suggest that VOA should be more of a mouthpiece for the administration of the day. There's a word for that: propaganda. If we ever have to go in that direction, I believe we would lose a significant portion of the nearly 172 million people that we reach, and our country would lose influence in the process. What America needs, in my view, is more, not less, of the kind of soft power represented by VOA and its sister organizations, which are, by the way, Radio Free Europe, Radio Free Asia, Al Hurra, and Radio and TV Marti. Believe me, our adversaries well understand the power of the media. Keep in mind what we're up against. And just to make sure you do, here's a sampling of Kremlin Channel 1 and what they were offering on a particular day. Do we have that clip?
Крым и Севастополь возвращаются в родную гавань. На востоке Украины происходят боевые действия. Вы хотите, чтобы центральные власти Украины всех там уничтожили? Мы не хотим и не позволим. Политически мотивированные санкции были ошибкой. Но этот механизм сдержек и противовесов нельзя было ломать. Наши американские друзья просто подрывают, режут суп, на котором сами сидят. Год непростых решений. Мы взяли на себя огромную ответственность и риски. И долгожданных побед. Мы гордимся вами. Каким он был для России и для ее президента. Об этом он расскажет сам. Россия своей ориентации не меняла. Медведь ни у кого разрешения спрашивать не будет. Но тайги он свои никому не отдаст. Так не будет. Большая пресс-конференция президента Российской Федерации Владимира Путина. Мы всегда, сотнями лет, опирались на свои ценности. Они нас никогда не подводили. И они нам еще пригодятся.
I don't think you have to understand Russian, although I know some of you do, to get the idea of what sort of programming this is and what sort of an image it is seeking to present. Vladimir Putin is one of the most slickly packaged heads of state in the world, even when he does keep his shirt on, as he does in these segments. According to the Russian international broadcaster RT, its signal is available now to some 700 million people in more than 100 countries, and there's money for more yet to come. During the fighting over Crimea, the Russian media spread the unfounded fear that Russian-speaking Ukrainians were targets of what it called revolutionary chaos in Kiev. More recently, the mainstream Russian Life News channel offered up a quote, analyst who blamed the Charlie Hebdo attack on U.S. intelligence agencies bent on sabotaging the fight against terrorism, which of course the expert said the fight against terrorism is being led by Russia. So besides building up Putin, the Kremlin media's main effort is not so much to convince people to believe Moscow's account as to try to sow doubt in others. Don't trust anybody is its overall argument. There is no such thing as reliable information. And that is the point that we must contest. Behind this budget, the effort is huge, but I don't think we need to match authoritarian media spending dollar for dollar. As Joseph Nye again says, quote, the best propaganda is not propaganda. We do, however, need adequate resources to stay in the game. These days, in many markets, audiences, quite frankly, expect high-definition television, polished production values, and clever use of social media, as well as old-fashioned reliable journalism. So it does take money to be in the game. I spoke earlier about VOA being poorly understood in Washington and underfunded in some ways, but you should know that there is hope on the horizon, in my view. Recently, the Senate has confirmed a new broadcasting board of governors. That's the group that appointed me. The team is now headed by Chairman Jeff Shell, who's the head of Universal Pictures. And that board has appointed the first ever full-time CEO for U.S. international broadcasting. And I am frankly thrilled by the caliber of the person that they have been able to recruit for that role. A few days ago, Andy Lack was sworn in as our first ever CEO, my new boss. And Andy is a respected media manager. Some of you may have heard of him. He has a successful track record at places like NBC and Sony and Bloomberg Television. I am excited to be working for him and excited about the path forward for Voice of America and U.S. international broadcasting under his leadership. A key task now for Andy, for myself, and for the rest of us working on this will be to convince the American people and their elected representatives that this media stuff matters, not a little. And as a nation, we have a history of sometimes overrating the usefulness of hard power around the world and underrating the soft power that is in fact at our disposal. Here's the thing, soft power isn't soft. There's a reason some governments work so hard to prevent their people from hearing alternate voices from outside their borders. In a time full of challenges for our country, America's voice, the VOA, is a powerful weapon, far more effective, I believe, than most Americans realize. And as a nation, we can and we should make more effective use of it in the years to come. Thank you. Those are my prepared remarks, and now I look forward to a conversation with Frank and with all of you. I thought it would be good to see some of the pictures.
Thank you very much, David. And thank you for giving us such a vivid image of all this. Now, before we start our conversation, just in the nature of credibility and full disclosure, I should tell those who may not know and our students that when I moved to Washington to work at the Voice of America. I was an intern there. It's also because of that I met my wife, so I have to say, who's here? So she's heard the VOA stories many times, in many ways. David, you raise a lot of things. I want to start with this idea of why this matters, because you make a compelling case for that. But when the VOA went on the air, as you point out, it was shortwave. There was an iron curtain. There was a distinct population that was being deprived independent information. There was no internet, there was no email, there was no texting. There really was no alternative. Maybe the BBC and Deutsche Welle in its own time. But when the VOA went on the air, the VOA had a very important central role. With all the voices and independent information out there, I'd like you to explain a little bit more why you think this is so important now. Because many would say people can get this information other places, no matter where they live.
There are a lot more voices now, Frank, in many markets. We still work in some markets where there are very, very few voices.
Are you hearing him? Is his mic on? Is that?
Is this mic on? Oh, no, I know. I have to turn this thing here. There you go. Hear me now? It depends what market you're talking about. I mean, I have 45, 46 language services, and I always say that I have to have 45 strategies. In some parts of the world, yes, there are now many voices and many choices. We are in one of those places. There are still some countries around the world which have almost no information. North Korea, not very many places broadcasting to North Korea. We are one of the few. And there are parts of Africa also where we're one of the very few voices. That said, yes, there's quite a cacophony of noise out there. Lots of different broadcasters, lots of different choices people can make. But what I think we offer is a certain kind of credibility, frankly. People in markets around the world know that VOA journalism is done carefully and carefully sourced, and that we take responsibility for it. And we have, over time, in different countries, built a credibility for what we're doing that cuts through the cacophony, that gets through to people. And people go out of their way to try to see what we have to offer, whether it's on the internet or on television or on radio.
So take us then deeper into an example for this information that you're bringing. And let's take Russia. You showed these very dramatic pictures, and we certainly know what the picture is in Russia. What exactly are you reporting? What are you saying? How are you getting to people? If you're being jammed out of the airwaves, how effective are you at getting through and to whom?
Russia is a very internet-savvy country. There are a lot of people on the internet. Young Russians are among the most tech-savvy people on earth. It's also a very educated population. So we have basically primarily an internet strategy, a digital strategy. We do programming that could be video, streaming, conversations. It can be written, it can be audio, interacting with our audience, engaging with our Russian audience. And a lot of times it's the young Russians telling us what they would like to have us get an expert on to talk about with them directly sometimes on the air so that others can see it.
Are you trying directly to counter the lies?
Absolutely.
How?
You know, it's difficult work because obviously we're up against an authoritarian government that's trying to control the message. But we counter the message by pointing out the errors. The Russian media are pretty ineffective when it comes to checking their facts. And there's 2 or 3 things a day usually.
So are you fact checking?
We're fact checking the Russian media. Yeah.
So how do you fact check who's doing what in Ukraine, for example, to reveal Putin's misrepresentations and lies there?
Well, just in the last few days, there was another attack on civilians, killing a bunch of people on I guess it was a bus or a tram. And there is clear evidence that, which is cited by multiple different sources from different governments, that the firing came from the area controlled by the rebels supported by Russia. The Russians are trying to create confusion over where, the shot could have come from anywhere. Who could it be? Who could it be? You know, is it under this rock? Is it under that rock? We just stay with our sources. We talk about what evidence there is, why there's evidence of where the shot came from, and what kind of evidence there is. And the facts are what they are. The Russian Kremlin is entitled to its own opinion, but not to its own facts.
And what impact, what effect is this information having? Is there any way to...
It spreads very widely and very quickly. It goes viral on the internet in Russia. So it's part of the conversation that the Kremlin cannot avoid being there. That's our function, and Radio Free Europe's as well. They play an important role.
You talked about denied areas. So, and you talked about Russia, China, Iran, the 3 areas you mentioned.
Right.
Would you discuss how you're engaging in those places? Because there's a very different, they're all very different.
Yeah. Well, take Iran. In Iran, we're on television, and that's our big play. And believe it or not...
So you're not on television in Russia, but you're on in Iran.
Yes. Well, we have satellite television to Iran. It's illegal to have the kind of dish that receives our signal, but about 1/3 of the country has one of these dishes, and about 1/4 of the country watches VOA television at least once a week. It's an enormous amount of access we have to the Iranian people. So there we are a significant part of the media presence in Iran.
What are they watching? What kind of programming are you doing?
On us?
Yeah.
The biggest audience is for hard news.
Really?
At 8 p.m. there's a late news broadcast, and that's where our biggest audience. We also do some comedy. We do a little bit of, lighter fare.
You have the Iranian Jon Stewart, is that?
Well, we did, yes, and now we have a stand-up comic based in Los Angeles doing New York doing a comedy show.
In Farsi?
Yes, yes.
So why are taxpayer dollars paying for Iranian comics?
Because the jokes have an edge to them, and because part of the thing we're trying to do is part of our mission. What our charter says. Here's what the VOA charter says. Please give reliable news to countries that the President and Congress have decided need to get it. Secondly, please explain America and American culture and society. And thirdly, present American policy and responsible views thereon. So under the aegis of explaining America and the openness with which we joke about things here, and the role of humor, which is not small in our country, we put on a little bit of comedy. Why not? It pulls in a younger demographic and gets them hopefully interested in the news as well. But did you know there are 800,000 Farsi speakers in California alone?
Now I do.
Yeah, now you do. And now you all do. I mean, here's the thing, what's happened. I mean, when the Farsi service started at VOA, they were aimed at Iran. But every major language in the world is now global. And every one of my language services has to think about the populations in a global way. Somalis are in Somalia, but they're also in Minnesota. And so we're talking to that whole diaspora as well as to those in the country. And then that diaspora communicates with the people back in the country. They're also a subject for us to cover. The 800,000 Iranians in California are a wonderful, big, rich topic for us to cover. That's America too.
The other very big story and very big challenge is communicating to China, as you mentioned.
Yes.
And with recognition and thanks to our Chinese graduate student here and others, I'm very interested in, so what are you trying to do?
The Great Firewall is pretty effective. The Chinese are quite good at blocking. They censor, they block the radio. That doesn't basically, very little shortwave gets through. It's jammed. I mean, it does get through, but it's difficult. And there's not much audience there. The internet, we spend millions of dollars on circumvention techniques. Basically coming up with new ways for people to get around the Great Firewall. And it's a cat and mouse game that's played all the time between ourselves and the Chinese censors. We find new ways, really every few minutes. There's a new technique, a new workaround. And we put it out so that people can still get our internet writings. And on the internet, for example, when the new leader of China was just coming into power, he wrote something called the Chinese Dream, which was designed to sort of say, here's my vision for what China wants, what the Chinese people want. One of our senior writers wrote a really terrific piece comparing that with the American dream and saying, it's nice to be rich, but you might also want to be free. You might also want to have some control over what your government does. You might want to have a voice. And that piece by Sasha Gong went viral, and something like 20 million people, 10 or 20, somewhere between 15 and 20, I think it was, million people saw it before the censors were able to get it off the various sites. So we try to provoke a conversation in front of the Chinese and with the Chinese people about some of the issues that matter to us and that we think matter to them.
Critics have taken aim at the Voice of America and the Broadcasting Board of Governors and this whole sort of cacophony of international broadcasting that emanates from this country and they have said it is duplicative. You've got Radio Free Europe and Voice of America and Radio Marti, that it is not targeted and effective, that it could be more aggressive in using technology. What are you hoping that Andy Lack and this new BBG, what are you hoping that they will do to make this a more effective effort and enterprise?
Well, I'm just very excited, obviously, as I've made clear, that Andy's joined us. He's a real professional. What we needed, I've thought since I became director 3.5 or plus years ago, was a full-time boss with the resume to run a big media
To do
company.
what?
Take advantage of the things that are going on right now we're in the middle of a human communications revolution right now. I don't know where it's going to end up, but the opportunities that are becoming apparent to us. I mean, I've now got journalists in my Hausa service who don't work for radio or television. They work for the mobile phone. They just do journalism for this thing, this device we all have on our belts. It's aimed at that, and you saw in the clip there, it's aimed at a young audience in northern Nigeria. It tells them where's Boko Haram, where's safe to go, where isn't safe to go.
You're giving them actionable information.
Actionable information. And it draws them in with a menu of other interesting news about America, about life. So some of those new technological changes are things that we need to jump onto. And I think with the additional heft that Andy Lack brings to the job, it's going to be easier to get on the wave and stay on it, if you will, of communications change that our globe is in the middle of. I think we've done some very good things in the last few years. The mobile phone is just taking over. Eventually, we'll all be streaming video, and this will be the main device by which you get news. It's already the case in some of the markets we're working in. So we've got to stay on top of that. And we've also got to figure out what is it that we uniquely have to offer as Voice of America. There's no need for us to do a lot of commodity news. If Reuters has got it, let Reuters do it, And on our websites, I've increasingly said to journalists, if Reuters did a perfectly good piece on it, just put that up on the website. Spend your time on something where we have value to add. Let me give you a couple of examples of where we do. When the Boston bombing happened, I don't know, but I think we may have been the only news organization in America that has a Chechen journalist working for it. She had sources within the Chechen community. She was able to add insight and kind of depth and granularity to the kind of stories that we were able to do about the Boston bombers. What motivated them? Who are they? Why are they here? And what's this about? Very interesting journalism. I wouldn't say there was any big breaking story, but it was just granularly interesting. When that kid got hid in the wheel container of an aircraft and flew to Hawaii and somehow survived, we got the first interview with his father, and we knew his community, and we knew all about him before anyone else. So ABC and CBS had to quote us because we were able to add value because we had a service from the country that he's from. So we have some unique value to add. The other thing we do, of course, is that we explain America and American policies to a sometimes bewildered world. I mean, this is a big, fascinating, powerful, and sometimes confusing country.
That's a very interesting thing. It's a distinction to point out for people who may not be familiar. The Voice of America's role is to do the news on the one side and explain policy and explain America's position on the other. They were separate entities within the Voice of America. Are they still?
No, I mean, these are the areas that the Charter asks us to do, and we do them in the same broadcast. There is, however, I think you're referring to editorials.
Correct. Commentary.
There are commentaries. They are done outside of VOA by an office called the Office of Policy, which is over in another piece of the bureaucracy called the IBB, because we don't want to be writing editorials. But we do put them on our websites and some of our shows when we deem that they are appropriate.
And this is what some of your congressional critics will jump on. They say we should be doing more of that. We should be explaining, using the taxpayer dollars and the VOA bandwidth to explain more of American policy, defend American policy more robustly. And your response to that?
I agree with them. I would like to have more on. VOA is a platform for the presentation of material. I want our journalism to be journalism, and that's, without fear or favor, as balanced as possible, as objective as possible, and presented as journalism. But there's absolutely no reason why we can't also have on the VOA websites or some of the shows editorial opinion, commentary, so labeled, clearly framed.
Explaining America.
Why not? Why not? So we might have differing views on things.
Because you talked about propaganda. Doesn't that start to get close to propaganda? That's been some of the journalistic concern in the past.
People go on websites and watch television shows not only to find out what the news is, but also to find out what people they think are interesting have to say about it. The U.S. government has interesting things to say about the world around us, which people would like to know about in some detail. I see no problem with having journalism about that and also presenting opinions about that from U.S. government officials and perhaps others. And those officials don't have to just be from the party in power. They could also be, we could run Senate speeches by Republican leaders in foreign policy and call it a commentary. So there are a lot of things we can be doing, and if Andy Lack wants us to, we will. I would like us to do a better job, though I think we do a pretty good job of describing what American foreign policy is. And people like Secretary of State Kerry, he's given us multiple interviews in the last few months for different services because he recognizes this is a very good way to reach large audiences, like the one in Iran, for example. If he wants to talk directly to the Iranian people, there is no better way to do it.
My last question, then I'd like to turn it over to the audience for your questions for David. You talked about some of the issues, challenges you have of hiding in plain sight. People don't know that you really are all about. You also talked about some of the budgetary realities, true fighter jets, I think.
Yeah.
So it's a few years hence, and President Clinton calls you and says, and it says, or President Bush or whoever's in there. We're pretty original people. And says we're going to give you 2 more fighter aircraft worth of budget. We'll double your budget.
I'm so glad you asked me this question.
How would you spend that, David? Because I also reflect on when it was Secretary of State Clinton, she went to the Hill and she said, we are losing this war, this information war. If you had the resources to engage it much more fully, what would you do?
Well, let me answer the question in terms of today, okay, because I'm living in the moment in a way. If I had additional resources right now, 3 things. First, I would look for ways to improve the West's broadcasting in the Russian language. And I don't just mean VOAs. If it were up to me, and this is my opinion, this is not U.S. government opinion, I would like to try to get, to find a private broadcaster who wants to set up a Russian channel to compete with great sports rights, good translated soap operas, American shows, news done by local stations in the countries where there are large Russian minorities, and then maybe also programming by VOA, Deutsche Welle, Polish television.
But you would,
others.
VOA would fund this private entity or the U.S. government?
I would like to see the U.S. government collect together the people in a room and get a private sector operation going, because frankly, it would be more nimble, it would be more, this could be commercial, it could be actually viable as a business.
And isn't that competition for VOA?
VOA is not about trying to win audience share just for the sake of it. We're not selling soap. We want to be part of the conversation in countries. We want people to understand our country and its values. We'd like them to be well informed, just because we think that's in our country's interest. So no, we're not competing for audience share with anybody.
So one item would be a Russian.
So one would be a Russian language effort, a major one, bigger than we're doing now, and with private sector involvement. If we're talking about what I would do today, I would like to further up our game in Kurdish and Turkish against ISIS. I mean, dealing with the ISIS threat. There are a lot of things, I mean, I can get into more detail on that. The third thing I would do is add additional resources in Mandarin. I have moved quite a lot of effort into something called Weishu that we saw a little bit of there, which is a satellite TV program in Mandarin to China. Our audience is 8 times larger than it was when I became director. And so I think we've shown that the concept can work. That audience is partly internet and partly the satellite TV effort. I'd like to put more effort into it.
Meaning more programming, more distribution, what?
More journalists covering more stories, more interesting television programming, additional internet effort, more people writing on more topics, interesting, stimulating coverage, smart, young Chinese Americans writing interesting stuff. You know, we could reach China in a much larger way, even despite the firewall. We could reach more Chinese, and I think that would be in our strategic national interest. So I guess I'd say Russia, China, and the ISIS area would be where I would, if you gave me money tomorrow, where I would put most of it.
Let's open it up to your questions. An awful lot of challenges and a lot of, a world of broadcasting internet out there. Who'd like to go first? I hope this isn't a shy group. It's not. Go ahead. We have a microphone. Let's bring this down here. Let's just wait just 1 second. If you'd stand, introduce yourself, and then fire away.
Hello? Is this sounding like it's working? Okay. So I'm Elizabeth. I'm a former student at George Washington. I was an international development major here. So we're talking a lot about America bringing our media into other countries and having that improve our relations with the people in these countries. But I was wondering if you've ever had more of like a fair exchange program where we're offering media in, providing culture, American culture to China, to Russia, but have we ever asked countries to bring their media into our country so we as an American people can learn more about their country when that benefit our relations with, maybe not a Russia or China at this time, but even other countries, that we could have more of a fair exchange with them.
Well, a couple things on that. One is we don't have to ask Russia and China to send us programming about their views and their culture. CCTV and RT are on the air here. You can watch them. And there are a number of other channels through which you can learn more about Chinese culture, Russian culture, and the culture of a number of other countries. So there's 1,000 voices certainly available in this country. In terms of sharing with other countries, I would just say this. We're starting to increasingly have affiliates around the world with whom we exchange programming. For example, we have a big new affiliate in Nigeria now called Channels TV. It's a private broadcaster, and they're very good. We're on every day doing a bit of journalism, usually more than one, on their air for their very substantial
or
audience.
are they taking a correspondent?
They're taking live shots with correspondents. They'll take
from around the world, from the U.S.
Yes, from around the world. Mostly Washington, New York, but sometimes they're in Rome with the Pope, or they're in London for something, or they want something from our bureau in Cairo, or whatever. So we're doing a lot of reporting for them, but we like their work. So we're starting to put their work sometimes on our television. We have a show in English called Africa 54, that's broadcast all over Africa, and we sometimes use the Channels TV correspondents reporting about news that's interesting for that audience. So there's an exchange going on there, and I like to see more of that sort of thing. You've got to obviously build some confidence first that the organization you're sharing with is in sync with our values in terms of getting the story right, But once that's done, I'm all for sharing. It's great.
If you don't mind a follow-up question, is there ways that we're looking at turning up the volume on Africa and China and other cultures? So when the Charlie Hebdo attacks occurred, I think that there was a particular sentiment from people who were confused as to why that news was being covered more frequently than what was happening with the Boko Haram in Nigeria. So going forward, have we been looking more at turning up the volume on the news going on in other parts of the world, in Africa, in China?
We have 19 stringers in northern Nigeria alone in our House of Service. And we've been covering the activities of Boko Haram way before anybody else out here even knew about them. And we will stay covering them long after, inshallah, those activities die down. So we're, our news mix has included the story of the Boko Haram atrocities right from the start, and we're on that story with some depth and some texture, and will stay so. But the Charlie Hebdo story was a big story globally too, and different websites and different services, put different emphasis on which was larger for them.
Another question, sir.
I'm Adam Clymer.
I know. Nice to see you.
In the 60s, I worked in Moscow. And while they didn't necessarily believe what we were telling them on the VOA, there was a general contempt for what they got in the Soviet press. There was a saying, Russian won't capture it anymore. In Pravda, there's no news, and in Izvestia, there's no truth. Pravda being truth, and Izvestia being news. Do you have any sense of how credible the Chinese press or the Russian media are to the people of those countries today? Ones you're contradicting, but you know what they...
Well,
did you all hear the question? Were you able to hear the question?
Yeah, I'm not sure the mic is working, in fact. But do you want to repeat something?
No, I think everybody was able to hear that. Yes,
right?
I'm seeing, yeah.
Adam, I don't think I'm an expert on that question. I guess I would say that in Russia right now, the president appears to be very high in the popularity ratings. His invasion of Crimea and some of his other activities seem to be overall popular with the Russian people. Not sure how deep that goes, but it's wide. So it is a challenge for news organizations like our own that are pointing out some of the problems while reporting what Mr. Putin says, also pointing out some of the problems with his policies and some of the price that the Russian people are paying for them. It's challenging. It's a difficult market, and it's not just because they're jamming our broadcast, but because my perception, at least, but others may have different views, is that Vladimir Putin's policies are relatively popular in Russia.
They're very popular in Russia.
Yeah. So what we're trying to do is put into the mix, into the conversation in Russia, the concept that there may be some problems with that, that they ought to think, they ought to reserve judgment, that they ought to be thinking about some of the implications of the policies. In terms of China, I don't think I can really offer much. We're broadcasting to a big, powerful country with authoritarian controlled media. We're trying to get some other ideas into the mix. For example, the History's Mysteries segment that I mentioned, where we tell the true stories of what happened in Chinese history that the party wants to suppress and wants people not to know about. From what I hear, those are very popular. They do very well in terms of internet clicks, and when Gallup does audience polling, which they and other polling organizations actually work for us in China. Gallup doesn't do China. When we've had audience data collected, we've found that as I say, our audience is 8 times larger than it was some years back. It's still very small. This is a pretty challenging matter, trying to reach China and Russia with the kinds of news broadcasts we attempt to get through. But it's worth the candle. It's worth the effort. There is reach.
Let's go to this woman in the front, and then we'll go back to Miles.
My question is, how much of what the VOA and what you do is reporting and kind of pushing out that news versus an interactive to kind of engage those audiences, maybe in more of a conversation? And then what do you think the benefit is of each of those types of media instead of the Voice of America?
We do everything, every kind of broadcasting and interaction known to man. All the way from shortwave radio, we still do it. Half-hour radio or hour-long radio broadcasts that are, the voice on high, listen to your little box and hear what we think the news is, all the way over to interactive Skype chats with young Russians in St. Petersburg and Moscow, where they tell us what the topics are they want to discuss. We get an expert on to discuss it with them, and they drive the train as much as we do as to what's the conversation about and where's it headed. So, and everything in between. And people say, what's your philosophy? Where are you headed? And I say, again, I've got 45 markets. And which one do you want to talk about? Because they're all different. And they're all changing over time. Shortwave, the effectiveness of it is decreasing globally, gradually. Some places still very, very, Zimbabwe, North Korea, Afghanistan, still very useful. And some other places. And it will be for some time to come. In other places, like in northern Nigeria, shortwave is declining. But the mobile app is incredibly effective. We've got millions of new people coming on to us from that. So I can't generalize. Different things work in different places. What's so interesting is that the way humans communicate is changing so rapidly. And actually that's good for people like VOA because it gives us new ways, new techniques we can try.
But it also brings huge amounts of competition for you. I mean,
yep.
Adam was asking about a time when there was Izvestia and Pravda and the Voice of America and the BBC, and it was black versus white and East versus West. But now you've got Al Jazeera and CCTV and Deutsche, you've got all these things. So it's so much harder for any news organization, any information source to break through.
That's true.
In the way that happened years ago.
That's absolutely true. You have to do it with credibility. You have to build credibility. And we do have one other thing going for us, which is we are the state broadcaster of the United States of America. And whether people like us or they don't like us, they do want to know what we're saying about them.
Interesting. Another question away, and then we'll come back in.
Hi. I just wanted to ask about, in terms of going back to what you were saying a few minutes ago about establishing, if you could, a bureau in Russia. Wouldn't
We have one.
What?
We have a bureau in Moscow.
Through private broadcasting.
Broadcasting, yeah.
Through private broadcasters. Getting back to that idea, wouldn't the Kremlin block like an official, bureau being established that was?
Well, let me explain.
Like
We do have a bureau in Moscow. We have a reporter based in Moscow, and Radio Free Europe has an office in
You have
Moscow.
one reporter in Moscow.
We have one permanent reporter in Moscow. We often have 2 or 3, depending on the situation, at a different time. And Radio Free Europe, our partners, have a couple dozen, if not more, based in Moscow. The problem, what they don't have, is a way to reach audiences, and an easy way to reach audiences. When Boris Yeltsin was president, we were getting on to local Russian radio and television stations. When Vladimir Putin took over, he took us off all of those. So now it's back to the internet, and as I say, one thing that we are able to do is get on certain Russian cable channels that, for one reason or another, seem to be willing to put our reporting on the air. So we try anything we can. The other thing we could do is put up a satellite broadcast in Russian. That's what we do, as I say, in China and Iran. The problem is that not too many Russians have satellite dishes. And when they do, it tends to be the kind that's sold in Russia that's designed so that it can only get certain signals. So that wouldn't be the best way, probably. But for example, you saw the Nastayashi Vremya show in Russian broadcast to the periphery. And that's on TV stations in Ukraine, some of which are right close to the Russian border. So you got to try whatever works. But I'm sorry, did that answer your?
Yeah, I was just curious how, because I know the question originally was if you had more money, one of the things you might do is you might work with private broadcasters to establish this. And I was just wondering how that's different from what you're currently doing in Russia.
I just think we could get a pretty sizable mass audience of Russian viewers to a commercially viable Russian channel with Western values, Western shows, Western sports, and then we could put Western reporting on the news on that same channel, and I think we could pull in a bigger audience, particularly outside of the Federation itself, in the large area of the world that speaks Russian, because it used to be part of the Soviet Union or used to be part of the East Bloc.
And that won't be blocked by the Kremlin?
Not if it's outside Russian Federation.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Another question over here, if we can pass the mic.
I can speak loud enough.
Okay.
I'm an Army Special Forces officer. I'm very interested in your thoughts on Daesh, and I don't think that there is a military solution that can win that fight. It's a battle of ideas. You being the closest thing we have to an information element of national power, what do you need to defeat them? Do you need something like the USIA? Do you need a seat on the National Security Council? What do you need to be stronger in that fight?
I'd like to see our country take soft power more seriously than it does, because as you said, hard power alone is not going to win this fight, and there are quite a lot of fights it isn't going to win by itself. So more serious effort in the area of soft power would be a good thing for America as well as a number of other countries to employ. Then I get down to very, very nitty-gritty specifics, like what to do in the Turkish market, what to do in the Kurdish market, and so forth. And I can. You've got a little bit of that already. I can give you more if you want, but we have a pretty unique relationship with the Kurdish population, because we're the only major international broadcaster. We're in 2 dialects of Kurdish. We're crucial to them. And we get a lot of information from them, and we impart a lot to them. We could continue to build on that. We could, if we had a bit more money, we could be on more channels, we could reach more people. The Kurds, after all, are in Syria, Turkey, and Iraq. There are ways of reaching more people if we had additional resources.
But what about the part of his question?
Do more in Turkey as well.
What about the part of his question, which is quite interesting, about elevating the influence of soft power within the government here, whether it's a seat at the cabinet table or a reinstitution of a USIA type function to increase the voice here at home and not be hiding in plain sight.
I'm going to be honest and tell you, and this is my personal opinion, I'm sorry that USIA was abolished. I think that was a mistake. But that said, you know, we move on and we do the best we can. There are still some very effective public diplomacy programs. The State Department does a lot of work in this area. I used to work for them. I was at the embassy in Kabul doing that kind of work. And there's a lot that can be done. The other thing is I think that I felt since I got to this job that we needed an Uber. We needed an Andy Lack, whose voice will be, I believe, louder in discussions about policy, who I think will be at some higher tables, and who certainly has the reputation preceding him for having been a very successful media manager and leader. And I think that will allow him to kind of raise the game for our country a bit, help to do that, at least in the broadcasting area, which is his area of special expertise. So I'm hopeful that some of that is going to come about because of this change in the way the BBG has structured things. But you know, we need more effort, attention, and resources put to this particular problem for ISIS and for other challenges that we have, in my opinion.
Another question, right here in the front row, and then we'll go back to the back. We've got the mic down here. Is it working?
It is. It's connected to the front.
Oh, it's connected to the camera. Okay.
Hello.
So it's not for this, yeah.
Full disclosure, I'm on my second day doing my internship at VOA. So.
Great. From where?
Welcome.
Are you?
I'm doing. I came from University of South Florida through a scholarship.
Great.
We think of soft power as there are no casualties, but there are reporters on the ground, and so what does VOA guarantee for their safety? What are the resources available for reports on the ground? I'm originally from Eritrea, which is the biggest jailer of journalists.
So for folks in the back who may not have been able to hear, for full disclosure, she's in the second day of her internship at the Voice of America, and she asks about danger to VOA reporters on the ground, specifically in conflict areas, and points out that she's from Eritrea, which has been a point of conflict for quite some time. So.
Well, one of the worst days of my experience as director of the Voice of America was the day we lost one. We lost one of our journalists in western Pakistan. He was murdered, shot in the head at point blank while praying in a mosque. It was a very painful
Because
experience.
he was a
VOA journalist on the radio, on our DWA radio service. And they were trying to make a point, they were trying to intimidate the service and have us pull back and not cover some of the bad actors and some of the terrorist activities that they partake in the way that we were. We didn't pull back at all, and his family specifically asked us to reinforce our efforts.
But how do
and I would say that their activity backfired. But on the question of safety of journalists, I mean, you know, I used to cover wars for ABC News, and I went in harm's way in Bosnia, in Chechnya, in various other places around the world, and I'm very, very conscious of how dangerous it is. But I have to say, you know, it's more dangerous now than it was when I was doing it. Because back when I was in Chechnya, there were Russians shooting Chechens and vice versa, but they weren't trying to shoot journalists. Now there are people actually deliberately shooting journalists or attacking journalists. Terrible stories. In Brazil, there were people attacking demonstrators attacking the journalists covering them, in the hopes that if they attack that journalist, then that news organization will cover the demonstration more. I mean, there's a kind of a sad and crazy change in attitudes around the world towards journalists doing their jobs. So it's become even more dangerous. We're very conscious of that. And I don't want to lose any journalists you know, to tell stories. But the fact of the matter is, I find myself having to restrain them quite often. Our language service journalists in particular are very passionate about the stories that they're covering in countries that are sometimes quite dangerous, like your own. And they are they accept a level of risk sometimes that I'm not entirely comfortable with. And there are times when we will tell people, we're taking you off the streets. We're pulling back for a little bit. That's an order, because we don't like the security situation. But we do leave that we have to leave that judgment as to what is safe to do mostly to the people who know the place and can make their own judgment calls. There's an element of risk in journalism. There's an element of danger. And as I say, we lost one. I hope we don't lose any more while I'm director. But it's a built-in risk to the business we're in. There's no avoiding it.
Time for one last question. I think you had one in the back. Oh, I'm sorry, I'll come back here. Time for two.
How are you measuring the effectiveness of soft power? How can you measure the effectiveness of soft power to Congress?
To what? Congress.
To Congress.
Congress. How can you
To
measure
report to Congress.
your values?
That's a very, very good question, and one that we wrestle with, I would say, daily in one way or another. I mean, first of all, we do a lot of very serious, Voice of America and the Broadcasting Board of Governors, under which we are, spends a fair amount of money on polling. Polling not only just what are our audience sizes, how many people do we actually reach, but also what impact did we have on them? What did they think of it? How trustworthy did they find us to be? Would they pass on a story to someone else? There are a lot of kinds of questions one can ask. And we do serious polling as often as possible in a lot of countries. That's where we have the 172 million a week number from. So, and the size of audience matters. But that said, sometimes you're trying to reach not so much a mass audience, or you perhaps want to reach a particular demographic. You want a particularly young audience, or you want decision makers, the power group in a country where a very small group are running it. So we look for different ways to try to measure our effectiveness, and we're always obviously looking for anecdotal information. When I was waiting to come here an hour or two ago, I got an email that said, guess what? 2 former Somali service VOA journalists were named ministers today in their government. And guess what? Another former VOA journalist was named the Minister of Information of Afghanistan. That's anecdotal information indicating that people who even used to work for us are now going to be in positions of some influence in countries that matter to us. So there's a lot of stories like that that we collect to try to show that we do in fact have impact. And I use those two because they're today, and they're ministers, people who used to work for us. But there are lots of anecdotes about things that have happened because of our broadcasts, lives that we've saved, governments that have reconsidered policies because of something they heard on our air, and so forth. We have a lot of impact. It is sometimes very difficult to sort of prove it, if you will. And that's a constant area of work for us. Because I've been doing this for a few years, I kind of inherently know when things are kind of starting to work in a country or not. But proving it to the satisfaction of elected officials is another matter. You put your finger on something. It's very challenging, but very important.
All right, now our last question is right here in the second row. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm an alumna of the engineering school here at George Washington, and my profession is analytics. And I'd like you would to speak a little bit to the role that analytics plays in the work of VOA, like for instance with social media. Are you doing social listening to understand, you talk about refute lies, to understand which lies out there you're going to go after and refute, those sorts of things. So what do you do with analytics?
For those in the back who couldn't hear, an alumna of George Washington University in engineering, asking about analytics and how David and VOA uses analytics, and whether you do social listening
Well, the wonderful thing about digital media is that you instantly know how many people looked at it or responded to it, and if so, in what way. You can even know where they are. So there's quite a lot of interesting data you can gather. I mean, for example, a couple of days ago, our Khmer service, our Cambodian service, told me, well, we told you, Director, about a year ago that we had 1 million Facebook fans. Yesterday, we passed the 1 million mark inside Cambodia, and there are only 15 million Cambodians. So we're reaching a lot of people in that country now, and that's just one very big measurement. But our head of digital effort has much more detailed analytics that he's able to give on what stories people are interested in specific markets, and where we're not getting, where a story just nobody seems to read it, nobody's caring about it. So we need to find another way to present it. We need to, if we really want that story to be read, maybe the headline wasn't right, maybe it needed a different kind of picture, or maybe the way it was presented wasn't compelling enough. So we use analytics all the time to try to figure out what to cover and how to cover it. But I don't know that I can give you more detail than that in this kind of a discussion. It's way into the weeds very quickly. Analytics, particularly in the digital area, play a big role in helping us to figure out how best to reach audiences and what content is compelling to them.
David, I never let an opportunity go by when we've got a guest of distinction and accomplishment without trying to make the connection to our students here, for people who may be listening to you and thinking, I want to do what he does when I grow up. And we have a number of students in the room who might well want to be foreign correspondents, or might want to work for the Voice of America, or might want to have a voice in this incredibly complex, interesting global marketplace of ideas now.
Mm-hmm.
What do you counsel them? You know, what is a trajectory that makes sense as they are thinking about putting together their careers and their lives?
There's always going to be a need for journalism. I mean, a lot of major journalistic organizations have been pulling back, have been reducing. The newspapers, a lot of newspapers have died in the last 20 years because of the internet changing the way we all think and how we collect news and all the rest of it. But there's always going to be a need for good journalists. So if you're a news junkie and you want to get into it, I encourage you to do so. Don't have any illusions that it's going to be easy or necessarily lucrative, however, because things are kind of up in the air on that. I don't think the model has yet been found. We're still in the middle of a transition to different models.
Is the VOA hiring?
The VOA does hire sometimes. I mean, our budget has been cut a number of times in the last few years, but at the same time, we have to bring in new people. We want to bring in new people, and we constantly do bring in young people. We also have an internship program. We would welcome interns from George Washington University programs. And, you know, if you speak another language in addition, if you're a hyphenated American, then we might be very interested in you. Because actually, my building is full of people. I see a very distinguished member, the former head of our Greek service, you know, speaks elegant Greek and beautiful English. And he's a major figure in Greece because he was broadcasting for many years, George was, to our audiences in his native land, but speaking from this country. The nice thing about VOA is people are kind of, if they come from somewhere else, they came here because they really like what America offers. They like the freedom and the values that we represent, and they wanted to have the kind of life that you can offer your family coming here. And then if they come to work at VOA after that, it turns out they're passionate about the people back home too, and they really want to try to give them something back. Reliable information, for example, which in many parts of the world is in short supply. So it's a great place to work, especially if you are from somewhere else but now here. I'm very proud to be the director of it. I believe in the mission very strongly. I spent almost 30 years having a lot of fun being a journalist on the front lines. Now I lead this organization and I'm basically a bureaucrat. But I'm kind of paying my dues for all the fun I had before working for journalistic organizations and trying to help this one prosper in a period of enormous change and challenge, but I think also opportunity. And to help this one, which is also part of the United States foreign policy apparatus, and rightly so, to be as effective as it can be for our country. Because exporting the First Amendment is in our national interest. Giving reliable information to people around the world is in our national interest. We're not doing this out of charity. We're doing it because it's good for us as well as them. And I guess I would leave you with that thought.
Well, I would thank you, and I would just add a couple things. I mean, I think that what you've heard here tonight is a very thorough and interesting explanation of why these taxpayer dollars are spent in this way. People, human beings want information. We're hunters and gatherers of information.
Yep.
And regardless of the technology, we will remain hunters and gatherers of that information. And the better the information, the more we hunt and gather. I think that's human nature. And that's why a non-commercial, very credible, straight information entity like the Voice of America, bearing America's name, is as important as it is. It's also, I think, a good example for our students and for young people that there will be multiple voices, many ways to tell the stories, and many platforms and places where you can do it. So I'd like to ask you one other thing I meant to do earlier and I want to do again. David, being here and speaking from your perch as director of VOA is, I think, the second time we've had a VOA director in recent years. Last time was a wonderful event when Walter was still with us, and co-sponsored, brought to us all by our Institute of Public Diplomacy and Global Communication, and the director of that entity, Sean Ade, Professor Ade, is here with us tonight. And one of the things that we try to do through IPDGC is truly engage these issues through research and convening and other activities of how this soft power, this global communication and public diplomacy, people to people and informational exchange, can work and can make for a more informed planet and a more engaged America. So if you've got any questions about what we do at IPDGC, Sean Ade is here and we'll take your questions, and we'd welcome you to those events. And I want to again thank David Ensor for sharing his very valuable time with us here this evening. And if you've got any questions, please join us. Otherwise, please have a safe and pleasant evening.